Hello, and welcome to Document Accessibility 101, a CSUN 2020 session. My name is Ligia Mora, and I will be taking you through some of the fundamental concepts of document accessibility. I will be covering some of the basics, such as understanding what it is that makes a document accessible, why it's important, why there are various formats that can be created in terms of generating accessible documents, both in the physical and digital aspects, the structure of an accessible PDF, and some of the assistive technologies that are out there that will assist in interpreting these formats. Along the same lines, we will discuss the ways and how these documents can be created and what the best practices are for such creation. We will also talk about maintaining a document accessibility workflow so that not only documents in the present time are created in an accessible format, but also in the future. So let's start with a very basic yet crucial question. Why is document accessibility important? Well, it's not really a difficult question to answer, is it? Because if you consider the amount of people in the world that are visually impaired, 1.3 billion is not a small number, and it is only increasing. And a great deal more have visual difficulties. In the US alone, it is upward of 66 million people that have some sort of vision impairment. And for all those with visual difficulties who require corrective lenses, even with those lenses, sometimes it is not enough to be able to see clearly. This means that there is a huge number of people out there that require information and documents to be delivered to them or be made accessible to them in a format that is easy for them to interpret or ingest. So let's take a look at this from another standpoint. Yes, this is important because there are millions of people who require their documents to be delivered in an accessible format. And in order for them to be able to get access to the information that is really their right to receive, they still require these accessible formats. But what if that's not enough? What if some organizations don't feel that that is enough, even though that is the right thing to do, to provide information in whatever format is required for a person to interpret it in their own way? Well, for these cases, there are rules and regulations that dictate that this must be done. And therefore, there is a need to be compliant with these regulations. So now more than ever, it is every organization's responsibility to deliver information and documents in a format that is accessible to everyone. It is simply a matter of meeting the needs and requests of a large and growing population. This doesn't mean that for organizations or entities or even individuals who are currently not generating their documents in an accessible format, that in order to do so, they have to invest an extraordinary amount of money in order to do so. There are plenty of options out there that make it easy and cost-effective to actually be able to create documents in an accessible format or be able to take existing documents and transform them into an accessible format. And many of the solutions out there make it possible to create these processes or these workflows so that this can be done automatically. So once again, I ask this question. Why is it important to generate documents in an accessible format? Well, bottom line is that there are millions of individuals who are either blind or partially sighted. And there are rules and regulations that are basically stating that this needs to be done, that documents need to be generated in an accessible format. But really, the most important is that it is the right thing to do. Every single individual has the right to receive their information in whatever format is best for them, in whatever they choose, in whatever makes it easy for them to ingest that information, those documents, to get access to that information. And in the words of Marlee Maitland, no one should have to ask for access. It should simply just be there. Which brings us to our next question. What are document accessibility solutions? Very simply put, these are solutions that will take a non-accessible document and will convert them or transfer them into a format that is easily available for consumption by the blind or partially sighted. Now, these solutions can include a variety of things, such as They can be solutions that include software. They can be applications. They might be something where outsourcing is required, or where there is some sort of a workflow configuration that would need to take place in order to ingest non-accessible documents and automatically transfer them or convert them into an accessible format, whether it's for physical or electronic delivery. But basically what these solutions deliver is the ability to convert a non-accessible document into accessible formats. And yes, these solutions are governed by regulations that manage document accessibility, that dictate how these documents need to be created so that they are accessible, so that they are being offered to an underserved market and making these available to everyone and anyone. But it is also important to understand that there are different solutions out there, each of them to meet a different environment or a different individual's needs and requirements. But even more important to understand is the fact that non-compliance can be very costly. And because non-compliance can be costly, finding the right solution to meet the accessibility requirements in a timely manner can mean the difference between running an organization's day-to-day activity and having to pay huge amounts of money and fines when these measures are not taken to comply with comply with the generation of documents in an accessible format. Now, along with the growing population who require assistive technologies or documents in an accessible format is the growing amount of regulations, which are also getting stricter. Therefore, it is important and it is crucial to stay informed and educated on what all these regulations and what the regulations are requiring and how they are relevant to each organization's line of productivity. Now, some of the most common accessibility regulations are very familiar to a lot of people. For example, Section 508, Americans with Disabilities Act, Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities, and quite a few others that are very common and very familiar. And all these regulations focus on the rights of individuals with disabilities. And one of these rights is the rights to access to their information. Now, this information should be provided in documents in whatever format is required or requested by a recipient. And this can mean either an accessible digital format or a physical digital format, such as Braille, whether it's contracted or uncontracted. In a digital format, this means offering the ability to receive accessible PDF, whether it's WCAG or PDF UA, HTML5 accessible, if it's e-text, audio, pretty much anything that is capable of making an accessible format, generating that specific format for an individual when requested. One digital format that has been increasing in popularity within the last few years is PDF. And this includes both WCAG and PDF UA. Another is HTML5 accessible, which is adaptable and responsive. At a very high level, let's take a look at the structure of an accessible PDF. And this is a required structure. Now, there are similarities between a PDF UA and WCAG PDF. Both of them follow similar structure. There are some differences between one and the other, but for the most part, some of the same characteristics are required for both formats. For starters, an accessible PDF needs to be tagged. And what does tagging mean? That means having certain elements defined within the actual PDF itself, such as having a very well-defined title, headers within a page or within a document itself, determining which are headers and which sections are part of a paragraph. Defining those paragraphs, it's another element. You can have lists making sure that the right read order is scheduled or set up within a document so that when a PDF has been made accessible, if assistive technology is used to interpret a PDF, it knows exactly what parts to read first and in which order. Alternate text, making sure that pictures, images, graphs are defined clearly so that they can be described with the assistance of assistive technology reading these definitions. Hyperlinks, understanding when a hyperlink is encountered on a page, defining it as such, and making sure that all these elements are created in the correct format in the right structure. There are quite a few more, but these are just some of the basic elements or the basic characteristics of an accessible PDF. Now, once a document is generated as an accessible PDF, it is incredibly important to make sure that it is a valid accessible PDF. And to do so, there needs to be validation done on these documents. And there are tools out there that will run PDFs and determine whether all of these structures, all these elements are properly created into the actual document and allow users who are creating these documents or generating these documents to know and verify that their documents are indeed accessible. Now, there are lots of tools out there to verify the accessibility of a PDF document. One such tool is PDF Accessibility Checker. And as you can see, once you run a PDF through, it'll generate a report stating which elements passed, which ones did not, some of the warnings, some of the actions that might need to be taken. But these will provide detailed information about the structure of a PDF, ensuring that when a document is generated, a PDF document, that it is accessible. These types of tools will check the actual tagging format, the structure, making sure that all those elements are created properly. And once they are done, it will generate, as I said, a report, but also it will provide information about what is contained. There are, like I said, many tools that will provide this functionality. Tools for checking PDF UA, for those for checking WCAG compliance and verification. So it is important that once a document is generated in an accessible format, that it is run through a process to ensure that it is truly accessible and that it is meeting all the guidelines and regulations for making it making it an accessible document. Now, once information has been made accessible, that's really not the last step in actually creating information or making information available to those end users who require um, accessible information. The next step is for assistive technologies to be able to interpret the information. Now, assistive technologies doesn't necessarily mean that it needs to be an expensive piece of equipment or tool to interpret information. It can actually be as simple as a low-tech tool such as highlighters, but it can also mean having devices that will interpret some accessible format that's generated, software, screen readers, um, text-to-speech interpretation. So anything that will assist in interpreting documents that have been made accessible into a format that's actually understandable. And this can mean the difference between having simply a compliant document, a document that simply has been made accessible and it's compliant by all the rules and regulations, and between the having an accessible PDF which is compliant and usable. Now, in order to generate both compliant and usable documents, it is very important to understand the differences in the types of documents or the differences in the type of data that can be dealt with. And depending on the type of documents, there will be a different workflow or different configuration that we would be set up for each of these types. Now, it is necessary to understand that what I'm talking about at this moment is taking a fully composed document that has already been created and converting that into an accessible format. So not actually creating the document from the beginning as an accessible document. I will be talking about that later, but for this section, for this um, part that I'm talking about in terms of creating automation and workflow automation for the generation of accessible documents is taking a fully composed document. Now, there are two main types of documents. One is called transactional and the other one is called static. And depending on the type, there are different workflows or processes that can be set up to transform these documents into an accessible format. There are ways of setting up automation for both types of documents, but they are approached differently. Now, what is the difference between a transactional and a static document? A transactional is something that has cyclical information on it, repetitive information. For example, a mobile phone bill, explanation of benefits, bank statements, credit card statements, those type of documents where you are getting documents, for example, delivered once a month, every month, and they follow the same structure. And every month when you look at them, they look the same. The only things that's changing, or the things that are changing, and the variable information are typically the amounts, the quantities, the dates, but there might be two or three people that are receiving the same type of document, obviously with the variable information pertaining to each of their own personal information. And obviously, these are millions of documents that are generated per month. That's a typical transactional document. Static documents are the type that have random formatting. There's no real repetitive information between one document and another. It can be something published like brochures, manuals, data sheets, etc. And these types of documents, you wouldn't create any rules-based template to process them, whereas with a transactional document, you would be using formats such as rules-based templates to automatically process these. And depending on the type of document is a type of workflow that would be set up to convert these documents into accessible formats. Now, transactional documents are ideal for automation conversion, or an automated conversion. And why is that? Because again, the rules-based templates are very, very easy to create. It's a very simple process, and these can be created in batch process or dynamic, generated on the spot where needed. So these are a little bit more flexible in terms of creating the automation in a repetitive process, because again, they follow the same format or the same structure month after month. Now they might change from year to year, but a new template, a new rules-based template is created, and they continue to go or run through that process, which is automated, and ingesting documents that are not formatted or that are not accessible documents, and then generating those accessible formats very quickly and very easily. With static documents, yes, automation can be created in a workflow, but these are approached differently. The rules for the templates that are created for a static document tend to be a little bit different than with the transactional documents. In order to set up a workflow for automatically converting static documents into accessible formats, there needs to be some sort of automatic identification of the elements on the pages, or the elements on the entire documents that are being processed. And this can basically mean auto-sensing what are the individual tags that go with these documents. And those tags, those elements, are the ones that I talked about earlier: titles, headers, paragraphs, tables. And this can be set up, again, it can be set up as an automated process. It just depends on the tools that are being used. And sometimes it is required that some manual action take place when taking these fully composed documents and converting them into an accessible format. So what would be considered best practices for generating accessible documents? Well, it depends on the documents themselves, but ideally, the best way to generate an accessible document is from creation. Most applications nowadays, such as Microsoft Word, PowerPoint, Excel, etc., all have a built-in functionality for creating documents in an accessible format. So ideally, this is the best way to create a document in an accessible format from its creation. However, it is not always the case that people have access to the actual source of the documents. Many times, many organizations are dealing with receiving documents or documents that have already been composed, and they don't have the capability of actually going back and creating these documents. So when this happens, The next step is to determine what is the best process or the best workflow for each organization. And this depends on the volumes of documents that are being generated, the types of documents, whether they are static or transactional, who is creating these documents, if they're going to have the actual staff to manage a process in which they're going to be converting non-accessible documents into accessible formats. So this will determine whether they are going to implement an in-house solution for recurring document creation and generating these documents in an accessible format, or whether outsourcing is the best option for them. Now, the process of taking an existing fully composed document, so it's just a Word document or a PDF or anything that's fully composed in a non-accessible format and generating an accessible document, it's called remediating. And remediating fully composed documents, things to consider when this is an approach that needs to be taken, is whether the workflow is going to be an easy to use and maintain workflow, or if it's going to be manually intensive, and obviously if it's going to be cost effective. Now, these are factors that need to be considered before implementing a solution in an organization. And as I said, the best practices are, one, to determine what kind of an environment is being dealt with, whether they're large volume, small volume, static information, transactional information, and then take it from there, determining if the best solution is to bring something in-house or outsource the actual process for remediating these documents. So this basically means creating a plan, creating a culture of inclusion. So basically it just means creating these documents by design, creating accessibility by design, starting with the creation process, making sure that if it's possible, whoever is creating the documents gets informed and educated on how to use the tool to generate an accessible document from its creation. Not only is this the most cost-effective way to generate an accessible document, it is also the best route to generating not only a compliant document, but a compliant document which is usable. Because whoever's creating these documents, they know exactly what they're putting in there, what those images mean, what those tables should include. So it is the best route and the most cost-effective way to generate them. But as I mentioned earlier, it is quite often the case that an organization does not have control over who's creating these documents. And once they're fully composed, they need to actually take them from there and build their workflow around accessibility. And it is also important to consider that this isn't a major issue because most organizations are in this same boat where they actually, the majority of the times, don't have access to the actual source or the documents. So what they need to do is they need to create a workflow with accessibility in mind. It just so happens that the workflow might be taking in documents that are not accessible and generating them into accessible formats. So it's kind of like taking a look back in, I don't know, a long time ago before automated tools or automated doors were created or built into a building. Nowadays, anything that's new has to have these automatic opening doors, as well as ramps at a parking lot. So all these things are now created by inclusion. They're created with accessibility in mind. The same needs to be said with document accessibility. Create your documents or create the documents with accessibility in mind from the get-go. But until we get to that point, until everybody is creating these documents in the same way, there are ways that need to be considered to create a workflow that will generate these documents in an accessible format. And this, of course, means budgeting in accessibility or budgeting the accessibility workflow from the beginning so that that is considered and it is created and included from the very beginning of the workflow. And when it comes to remediating documents, there are options out there. One of those is, again, outsourcing information or outsourcing the documents to have these documents remediated or made accessible elsewhere, or keeping the process in-house. Now that can mean the difference between acquiring accessibility automation software that will run with that workflow and automatically process documents, any type of documents that are in not accessible format, and then generating them into accessible formats, whatever those may be. And that can include generating both physical outputs such as Braille or large text, as well as digital outputs such as accessible PDF, accessible HTML5. And also using the other option is accessibility services. So outsourcing or sending these documents out to an organization that offers these services for remediating documents. Now, it does depend, as I mentioned, on the environment. It depends on the amount of documents, on the type of documents, and how this is going to be done, as well as the people who are available or who are informed in document accessibility. Now, with either case or with either option, it is important to mention that being informed, and this is crucial no matter what, regardless of whether a workflow is going to be set up in-house at an organization or whether the volumes are low or high, it is crucial to be informed, to be educated, to know what needs to be done in order to create accessible documents, what makes an accessible document, and what makes it not only valid, not only compliant, but actually usable. So these are just things that are important things to keep in mind when creating accessible information. Something else to consider when looking at document accessibility is web content, whether it's archived or content that's actually located on a website. Making a website accessible itself obviously needs to be done, and it is important, but you also need to consider the content behind it. So if there are documents that are stored that are being served up on a website, these need to be made accessible. As well, if this is a portal onto serving up documents that are being pulled from an archive. There are tools out there that will search an entire website, known as web crawlers, and will identify any and all documents that are placed in a website. Now, once this is done, a process needs to be set up in place so that this content is examined to make sure that the content is accessible. And the cases where it is not, running these files through a workflow that will take the non-accessible files and generate accessible PDFs or accessible HTML5 or whatever the format required may be. And this is very common practice, being able to identify these PDFs or these documents. And once that's done, creating those accessible formats. Now, what sometimes can happen is once this is done and once everything has been made accessible on a website, organizations tend to forget that they need to actually maintain this level of accessibility. So one thing is getting up to speed and making the websites accessible, making the content accessible, and being able to actually offer this information. But another is planning ahead and creating a workflow, creating a process in which this is actually maintained. So the templates are created that anytime a new document is going to be stored on a website, it is made accessible before it is loaded, and actually being able to create this in a very easy and manageable process. After all, you want to make sure that your accessibility workflow is cost effective, and there are lots of tools out there that will provide this capability and making it easy. Now, the other thing is pulling up content that's in archives. There are archives out there that have information from 10, 15, 20 years ago. So how do you make that content accessible without actually having to spend huge amounts of money or time, investing lots of time and money in retrofitting? Well, once again, it's about choosing tools wisely. There are tools that will require the retrofitting or the going into those archives and taking all that information, regardless of how much data is in there. And it can be millions and millions and millions of documents that need to be converted into accessible formats. And again, it can be very expensive and very time consuming. Or using tools that will take that information and upon delivery or request, they are made accessible on the spot. And these are tools that can be set up to automatically convert these documents that are not accessible and convert them when they are requested instantaneously into accessible documents. So these are things to consider, depending once again on the environment, on the volumes, on the types of documents. But everything is possible. It's just a matter of examining the actual environments and what is the best workflow to meet an organization's needs. So just as with making information accessible or taking documents, both static and transactional documents that are existing in an environment and converting those into accessible formats, the same with websites and website content and archive content and making sure that an accessible workflow is created, it is important to test, making sure that testing is being done throughout the process and that quality control and quality assurance is being implemented throughout the entire process. And this is key, doing it from the beginning, not leaving the testing or the actual quality assurance or control till the very end, because if a workflow was set up and it took couple of weeks to set up this workflow, and it turns out that at the very end when it is tested that something is broken and it's not going to work, it's going to take quite a bit more time and money to actually go back and fix it. Whereas if the testing is being done throughout the building process, it will avoid any time delays and any cost associated with having to prolong that process because testing wasn't done from the beginning. So it is important to use everything that's available for creating this accessibility workflows. I mentioned early on using tools such as PDF Accessibility Checker, which is PAC, or PAC, the version is 3.0. Adobe Acrobat Pro allows you to test those PDF documents as well. And there are other applications and other solutions out there that will provide the capabilities needed for testing this information. And as I've mentioned a couple of times now, it is important to consider usability versus accessibility. You want to make sure that when these documents are created, that they are not only compliant, but that they are both usable and accessible. And of course, it is necessary to know that there are tons of great options out there, lots of tools, lots of solutions that will make this capability possible for any organization, for any environment, for any individual. But it starts with being aware of accessibility, knowing what needs to be done, getting informed, getting educated on what makes an accessible document, how it is a valid accessible document. And this type of information is really out there for everyone and anyone. It's just a matter of looking for it or finding the way to get educated, to get informed on all these topics. And it's very important to know that this is not going away. This is actually only growing. So one of the things to consider is, depending on the organization, again, and on the needs or the individual, if it's something that could potentially grow, making sure that a solution that is acquired is scalable, making it easy to implement assistive technology, making sure that everything that's generated is compliant, and using the application that is best fitting for an environment. So among the solutions and applications out there that provide this functionality that are available to pretty much everyone in any organization, there are some that are computer-based tagging tools. So some provide a graphic user interface for making the tagging or creating an accessible document very easily. Some include heuristic algorithms, generating those workflows in an automated fashion where the more information is processed, the more accurate it gets. Understanding, once again, the PDFs, the documents, the type of information that is being dealt with, whether it's static or transactional data, or maybe both, maybe a little bit of both. Finding out what the document structures and positioning are. All these things are very important, and there are tons of tools out there to provide this information and provide this functionality that is needed. Which leads us into thinking about things that need to be done when creating a plan for document accessibility. Obviously, it's determining whether remediation is needed for website documents, for any other kind of documents that are included in an environment, whether they are archived or readily available. Monitoring, making sure that ongoing audits are set up for both websites and archive information, making sure that when they're being served up, that everything is being delivered in an accessible format, determining whether they are high volumes or low volumes. And if they are high volumes, create a plan. making sure that it's not going to be time consuming or too expensive to process. There are tons of tools out there. If I haven't said this enough, I'll say it again. There are tons of tools and solutions out there to help implement a workflow that will manage from low volumes to very high volumes. And then planning ahead is important. Preference management, making sure that any kind of format that is required is being offered. Getting a tool that or a solution that will allow you to offer this functionality for end users to determine what type of formats they're going to be receiving, what they prefer, what is best for them, and allowing them to choose what best works for them. And of course, it comes down to educating end users or educating people who are dealing with these types of information, making sure that training is available, making sure that finding the right training for the right people, and keeping up with what's happening with this type of these types of regulations and what is the latest in document accessibility, and making sure that everything is being planned ahead. So once that workflow is configured, once those tools are in place, what needs to be provided? Well, it comes down to this. Reasonable accommodation needs to be made in order to offer accessible documents for all. And this means just basically allowing the end users to choose what type of accessible format is best for their needs. This is basically offering the specific formats for these requests. And again, why is this important? Well, because we need to plan for the future. Statistics show that the aging population is growing, and they are susceptible to macular degeneration and glaucoma. So they are going to, this growing population is going to be requiring some sort of accessible format. Blindness is expected to increase quite a bit. So we need to make accommodations for generating documents in an accessible format for everybody. Along the same lines, there are other people, there is a growing population where people with the necessity for document accessibility is growing. So these are things where we need to plan ahead, making sure that whatever we're building now will accommodate itself to actually provide the needs for future, which means providing a complete document accessibility platform. And this means being able to handle, as I mentioned, both static and transactional data. Obviously, ideally, and the best way to generate accessible formats is to do it from the document creation point. But as I mentioned a couple of times, in many cases and quite often, that's difficult to do. Typically, organizations will get a hold of documents that have already been created and they need to remediate on the spot. And being able to do so in an automated way, depending on, regardless of where the documents are coming from, is crucial. Being able to take on any type of information, whether it's transactional, static, being able to offer services or outsource the information if it's going to be the most cost-effective way for them, and generating the formats that are required, making that reasonable accommodation for generating either Braille, if it's a physical format, if that's required, or large print. Maybe it's generating accessible PDF, maybe it's generating accessible HTML5. Just focusing on the overall workflow and being able to provide the flexibility to generate information in whatever format it's required. Thank you for your time, and I hope this session has been informative and useful.